Oh, good morning, and welcome to the 2023 Sylvia Naish postgraduate lecture. My name is Gordula Weiss-Sussex. I'm Professor of German at the ILCS. And it is my pleasure today to introduce the lecture, the Sylvia Naish lecture this year, which really has become an annual event. It's funded from the bequest of Sylvia Naish, who was an enthusiastic linguist and translator. She was also a member of the Friends of Germanic Studies at the then IGS, the Institute of Germanic Studies. And so the lecture is chosen annually as a result of a competition that is open to all postgraduate students in this country. And the proposals sent in give us a really good overview of what's going on in the country in terms of postgraduate research. And sometimes there are some very hard choices to be made. But today I am very pleased to introduce our lecturer this year. So that's Sophia Buck. Sophia is currently completing her DPhil in medieval and modern languages at Merton College, Oxford. And her thesis title is Moscow, Berlin, Paris, Walter Benjamin's Transnational Spaces of Comparison. And Sophia has already presented her work at various conferences, and she's concentrated in these conference papers on the intercultural aspects of Benjamin's work and Benjamin's reception in East and Western Europe, and on Benjamin in the context of decolonial politics. She's also published in Monatshefte, Angermion, and also a chapter on blogging as Netzwerkstatt in a volume on transmediale Konzepte feuilletonistischer Schreibweisen der Gegenwart. So we are today going to be treated to a lecture entitled Baedeker durch das geistige Paris, Walter Benjamin's National Literary Histories as Travel Guides. Sophia, the floor is yours. I look forward to your lecture.
Thank you. Yeah, first of all, I want to extend my gratitude to the Sylvia Naish Trust and the committee for giving me the chance to present some of my findings I have come across during my doctoral research. And yeah, so it was already announced. I will share here. Here we go. Yeah, as the title gives away, I will talk on a quite popular thinker, the Weimar intellectual Walter Benjamin. Yet I hope to introduce some neglected texts from his journalistic activities during the 1920s that will illuminate in particular how his experienced cultural crossings are linked to reworking literary historiographies and canonization regarding national identity construction. After turning his back on German academia in the mid-1920s, Benjamin lived in and traveled to different cultural and political centers in Europe. Among the most prominent ones are Berlin, Moscow, and Paris. These days went along with exploring and reviewing primarily German, French, and Russian books. However, his journalistic activity was not limited to surveying contemporary literary developments only. It also provided the ground for Benjamin to reflect on the use, audience, and medium of national literary histories beyond the traditional academic monograph or anthology. In other words, he also examined cultural-topographical imaginaries inscribed to and produced by different forms of meta-literary communication, from philological and scholarship, literary histories, and literary criticism to journalism. In the following, I will briefly address Benjamin's broader engagement with literary histories, issues which are underpinned, first of all, by his disciplinary and professional crossings. Closely entangled with the latter are his cultural crossings, namely his international networks and transcultural outlooks of his publication venues. As we shall see, they prompted epistemic and methodic reflections on the role of a gaze from abroad for literary criticism. And finally, I will turn towards travel guides, more specifically Baedeker, and its historical innovation for travel behavior. It will set the scene for discussing two examples of how Benjamin experimented with different journalistic publication forms to mediate and map out other cultural literary scenes for German eyes. For example, the Russische Bädeker or a Baedeker durch das geistige Paris. In so doing, the geocultural outsider perspective serves not only to inform on literature outside the Weimar Republic, but also presented an epistemological merit to rework German self-perceptions about literary culture and its canonization. First of all, here you have an overview of all the reviewed books, so not all the books Benjamin reviewed, but especially those which concern not only individual literary works, but in one way or another they are historiography. And it, first of all, is just meant as a visual impression. Mostly those are anthologies for a particular genre, so we have here prose, poetry, and drama. They cover tendentially a particular language, or follow a national or provincial focus. Apart from literary, the list also encompasses books written by literary writers, not that many, I admit. There's also some from literary critics, a few more, and then the vast majority written by academic scholars. Apart from literary histories in the strict sense, Benjamin also continued to review academic scholarship on particular genre and periods, or even histories of academic disciplines, such as philology and its relation to Literaturgeschichte. What Benjamin traces and diagnoses throughout the reviews is a broader crisis of disciplines or discursive spheres, facing the condition of modernity with its technological and social restructuring. What is at stake for him, in short, is to renegotiate the relation between the field of literature, the function of literary criticism, scholarly treatments of literary history, and within all of that, the role of the intellectual. The critic's general issue with positivism and historicism also applies to the matter of Literaturgeschichte. In short, the former assumes that history is a succession of facts that can be retold in a neutral fashion, and has at times objective and even universal aspirations. They are methodological equivalent, and I have just chosen here one example, for literary history would be something like a literarische Monographie einer Landschaft, here highlighted in bold. Due to social and educational shifts of the growing leere Repräsentationscharakter der Literaturgeschichte. Oh no, sorry, I jumped a little bit. So it would be a literarische Monographie einer Landschaft that simply assembles biographical data about the authors and content reproduction. In another review, here we come to the Repräsentationscharakter, he diagnoses a link between a Krise der Bildung, so we have a crisis in education due to social and educational shifts, and the growing leere Repräsentationscharakter der Literaturgeschichte. The more or less similar reiteration of certain canonical texts perpetuates for him a cult about a particular universality of the, highlighted in bold a little further down, Kulturgüter der schönen Literatur, thus serving a consolidation of a canon and musealer character of the humanities. What Benjamin grasps here as a product of representation, we might say its hidden curriculum, often adds to a national or cultural conservative imaginary. For example, he mocks a certain representational cascade, which we can see here. Man erfährt damit, wie es in den Köpfen aussieht, denen das Bild einer Weltanthologie vorschwebt. Ein Gedicht ist ihnen vor allem Repräsentant. Das Gedicht repräsentiert seinen Dichter, der Dichter repräsentiert seine Schule, die Schule repräsentiert die Lyrik ihrer Nation. Which often goes along also with an essentializing causality that equals a landscape with a certain cultural or linguistic space and therefore essentializes its style or particularity. Often, Benjamin therefore claims that it is linked to a völkisches Denken, whose advocates he rejects as die Sachverwalter des Landschaftlichen und Stämmischen. On the contrary, he perceives the role and function of Literaturgeschichte and its methodological principle more in terms of a critical, interventionist, and highly time-specific manner. Here we go. Denn es handelt sich nicht darum, die Werke des Schrifttums im Zusammenhang ihrer Zeit darzustellen, sondern in der Zeit, da sie entstanden, die Zeit, die sie erkennt, das ist unsere, zur Darstellung zu bringen. Damit wird die Literatur Organon der Geschichte, und dies, nicht das Schrifttum zum Stoffgebiet der Historie zu machen, ist die Aufgabe der Literaturgeschichte. In short, literary history should target the interplay of literature that is impacted by its historical setting, for one, but also, for another, impacts modes of grasping or interpreting its present. In other words, Benjamin challenges literary history to undertake a historiographic reflection of present habits of seeing, which are expressed but also constructed in literary production. Thereby, the epistemic and disciplinary crisis of Literaturgeschichte appears to have its testing site and battlefield in the contemporary scene. Instead of taking a historicist scholarly practice as the model to approach contemporary literature, it is the reverse way for Benjamin. The literary practices of the present form a starting point to revisit the method and self-understanding of literary historiography. Here, discursive and professional contact zones are the most porous between the scholar, the literary critic, and the cultural journalist. On the one hand, Benjamin's criticism of outdated methods in scholarly literary histories is fueled by his own professional crossings, from academia towards a more journalistic occupation. On the other hand, as I would argue, it is his cultural crossings that enhanced and conditioned his inspiration of revising those historiographic practices from the mid-1920s onwards. Benjamin had first attempted to establish himself in German academia. After his habilitation was rejected in 1925, though, his quest of becoming an independent writer meant a reorientation to the journalistic sphere, a broader audience, and a different range of topics. Hereby, his journalistic occupation serves as a site or a laboratory for a vast and diverse text production in which he explores and also forges later theoretical interests. Now, let me outline Benjamin's international settings and networks that constitute what I will call his intercultural situatedness. With the latter, I mean a perspective on literary texts, artistic developments, and political phenomena informed by his movement between perceptions of the familiar and foreign. In the late 1920s, his travels provided the chance to navigate different spaces that challenged the restriction of national culture and the focus on isolated cultural or political practices, ranging from journals, international organizations, and clubs designed to foster cultural mediation, to various circles of émigré intellectuals and artists in different cities. Benjamin's own life in Berlin, like his stays in Moscow and Paris, were culturally diverse and sometimes conflicted. And to give you a little bit of taste of that, in Berlin, Benjamin had encountered émigrés of the Russian avant-garde since the early 1920s. Via the avant-garde journal G, Material für Gestaltung, which you can see on the left. Benjamin was introduced, among others, to the Russian-born émigré photographers such as Stone, here in the middle, and the works of the Hungarian constructivist and later Bauhaus artist Laszlo Moholy-Nagy, I think in English, Moholy-Nagy. As Michael W. Jennings has remarked, a long time before Benjamin became interested in Europe, Europe came to Berlin. In Moscow, Benjamin similarly navigated the foreign Soviet reality through the perspectives of other émigrés, such as Asjalat's partner, the Austrian theatre critic Bernhard Reich, and the Moscow-born Austrian journalist Nicolas Beseches. And in Paris, before his exile, his acquaintance and co-translator from Berlin, Franz Hesse, and his wife introduced him, among many others, to Marcel Briand, here on the left, from the journal Les Carriers du Sud. Benjamin would establish himself as a renowned critic, so that the French intellectual André Gide, here on the right, on his trip to Berlin in 1928, allowed only Benjamin to interview him. In other words, Benjamin met émigrés and expats in Berlin and in turn socialized with other German émigrés when abroad. This social fabric of internationally oriented or émigré communities enhanced Benjamin's awareness of international mediation not only as a subject of observation, but also as a challenge of how to position himself towards and between different cultural spheres. Apart from such personal networks, the media in which Benjamin published also formed a specific international sites. Within the vibrant landscape of literary journals, Benjamin consulted, for example, many publications with a comparative focus on European affairs. His interests ranged from depictions and reviews to critiques and translations published in German and French journals. For example, the literary magazine Die literarische Welt, Benjamin should overall publish 141 pieces here, was founded in 1925 and modeled on the French Nouvelle Littéraire. Thereby, it followed the implicit agenda of the editor Willi Haas to promote Franco-German cultural relations. Gustav Frank, Madeleine Podewski, and Stefan Scherer called the media historical function of such journals to be a kleines Archiv. By providing a framework, layout, and recurring sections, it pre-structured, selected, and profiled thematic threads as part of the journal's processual logic, meaning it provided a filter for discursive attention economy. Or indeed, as the editor Willi Haas has put it, the journal operates as a Art der Verständigung und Selbstverständigung der deutschen Intelligenz. In the case of Die literarische Welt, readerly attention was drawn to foreign affairs, literature in different languages, and transcultural entanglements, for example, with regular sections like Aus dem Ausland, Deutsche Autoren im Ausland, Pariser Tagebuch, Reisebücher, Zeitchronik der literarischen Welt. And as you can see in the massive list of the last one, this is ranging from America, we do have Elsa's Denmark, France, and even like there's a category saying so etwas gibt es, something like this exists. So drawing the attention also to a marginal spots, one could maybe call it. As you can see, the orientation in this literary mapping of the world has a clear international but also mostly European-centered outlook. I will give you one more example, this time of a slightly more niche magazine, namely the Dutch avant-garde journal International Review I-10, which was ambitious but yet only managed to be published between 1927 and 1929. It assembled contributors of the international avant-garde and covered cultural and political subjects in a transnational fashion. Contributions were featured in 4 languages: Dutch, French, German, and English. And mostly each contribution would be accompanied with a short abstract in the other 3 languages, turning the space, and I just highlighted 2 moments of like their self-description in the preface, as a space of like interdisciplinary, that's the first one, or like international juxtapositions. These journals, which aspire to shape the intellectual discourse and intellectuals' social and political role in their countries, were essential to Benjamin as he tried to find his own place and position in this cross-cultural terrain. Nevertheless, Benjamin occupied a relatively marginal outsider position compared to other contemporaneous figures and institutions that acted as so-called mediators. He neither established himself firmly as a translator for a particular publishing house, nor did he officially affiliate himself with a specific cultural political organization like, first one springing to mind would be Gesellschaft der neuen Freunde Russlands, the Bund der proletarisch-revolutionären Schriftsteller, or even the Pen Club, despite occasionally attending their events. So in what way did Benjamin perceive his position between different cultural and national spheres, and how did that shape his method as a critic, if not in the role of a mediator? It is instructive here to briefly look at how Benjamin's prolonged stays abroad shaped his methodological self-fashioning when approaching literary scenes of his time, and here the figure and more generally also the epistemic role of the foreigner will be of significance. In a letter, he linked his interest to from 1919. Here you have the letter. He linked his interest of exploring the contemporary French thought to the specific merit of journals for foreigners. And I will just briefly read out the full quote. Mich hat ein großes Verlangen gefasst, in die gegenwärtige französische Geistesbewegung, ohne jedoch je das Bewusstsein des Zuschauers zu verlieren, einzutauchen. Ich lese wahllos, nur um Fühlung zu bekommen. Ich halte die Nouvelle Revue Française. Hier ist für mich vieles, dessen Analogon im Deutschen mir vielleicht bis zur Fadheit durchschaubar wäre, noch Dichtigkeit, ein gefärbtes Dunkel, in dessen Klärung ich weiterkomme. Ich glaube, Zeitschriften haben überhaupt nur für den Ausländer Wert. Endlich lese ich mit größtem Interesse aus klarem Unbeteiligtsein, was Männer wie Gide über Deutschland sagen. Hier ist für mich noch Kontakt mit irgendeiner Fieber-Gegenwart, den ich Deutschem gegenüber kaum mehr erlange. So, while Benjamin declares his exploratory interest, he also highlights at that point that he himself, as the foreigner in this case, is detached and uninvolved and retains the consciousness of a spectator only. In the early 1920s, the role of the Ausländer also features when Benjamin intervenes against the centralizing imaginaries of cultural communities, specifically in the idea of Volksgemeinschaften Mitteleuropas. Benjamin first turned towards this concept, so the people's communities of Central Europe, in the text Kaiserpanorama, Reise durch die deutsche Inflation, written in 1923, translated into Dutch as Analytische Beschreibung von Deutschlands Untergang for the avant-garde journal I-10, and published in Einbahnstraße, One-Way Street in 1928. Paul Lützler reads the contribution in I-10 as a, I quote, späte Gegenschrift zu Friedrich Naumanns Mitteleuropa-Buch von 1915. In said book, the Social Democrat Naumann formulated a foreign policy building on the imperialist idea of a Central European alliance under German leadership to balance forces against Russia and the USA. Benjamin grasps this very idea or concept of Central Europe in the picture or like the image of the encircled communities of people. So for those interested, I'll give you the full quote here. However, as the whole passage will reveal, he presents it rather as a specifically German social pathology. So as a result of xenophobic ideas of alienation or a collective fear of those who humiliated after Versailles, which they're projecting outwards onto those encircled communities. He explains such essentialist concepts of the foreign and the own from a perspective of Germany's isolation. I quote, eben darum ist sie, die Luft, auch so voll von Trugbildern, Luftspiegelungen einer trotz allem über Nacht blühend hereinbrechenden kulturellen Zukunft, weil jeder auf die optischen Täuschungen seines isolierten Standpunktes sich verpflichtet. With such social perceptions, Benjamin captures them here in the register of optische Täuschungen, optical illusions lack, is a sort of epistemic self-reflection. And here again, Benjamin hints at the Ausländer. Dem Ausländer, welcher die Gestaltung des deutschen Lebens ohnehin verfolgt, der aber das Land kurz danach bereist hat, erscheinen seine Bewohner nicht minder fremdartig als ein exotischer Volksschlag. The foreigner is casted here as one who could have a complementary, relativizing, or even corrective external gaze from the outside. After his journey to Eastern Europe, a few years later, this standpoint undergoes a specific twist. In his diary, Benjamin names the output of the travel. Here we go. Es ist mit dem Bilde der Stadt und der Menschen nicht anders als mit dem der geistigen Zustände. Die neue Optik, die man auf sie gewinnt, ist der unzweifelhafteste Ertrag eines russischen Aufenthaltes. Mag man auch in Russland noch so wenig kennen, was man lernt, ist, Europa mit dem bewussten Wissen von dem, was sich in Russland abspielt, zu beobachten und zu beurteilen. What previously had been an interest in the foreign abroad turns into the experience of being defamiliarized from the own native background through having been abroad. For Benjamin, this new optic or reversed cultural perspective enables a more critical self-assessment of cultural self-descriptions. As we have seen, Benjamin in the 1920s is embedded in a both social and media fabric that produces, highlights and reflects, but also politicizes international and transcultural contact zones, also in response to different national traditions and self-perceptions having come into crisis after the First World War. Navigating these scenes and profiles his own standpoint or method as a critic. Benjamin's reflections on his own cultural and local embeddedness undergo, as I have shown, a specific twist. And I have tried to capture that a little bit more schematically here, so you can trace it maybe better. For one, he early identified the use of journals, we are in 1919, for the foreigner in order to get an orientation in the literary and intellectual scenes abroad. Thereby, the Ausländer appears in an interested yet distant position of a spectator. In the course of the 1920s, he then criticizes imaginaries and cultural self-perceptions that are based on perspectival isolation, leading to projections and optical illusions if not confronted by a relativizing external gaze. Here he brings up the Ausländer as possibly enabling such a corrective epistemic self-reflection. After having traveled eastwards himself, Benjamin then names his outfit to be a reversed cultural perspective, so the new optics or neue Optik from Moscow on to Berlin. Prominently, it was after this stay in Moscow in an article that he noted, I quote, Das jetzige Schrifttum Russlands ist Vorläufer einer neuen Geschichtsschreibung, weit eher als einer neuen Belletristik. Benjamin here refers to the growing significance of infographical, statistical, and diagrammatic practices. We maybe could say a mass alphabetization through images in the USSR. He links structural shifts in social and educational orders to the task of revisiting epistemic habits that also govern literary historiographic imperatives. So, how did this intercultural mobility play out in Benjamin's approach to contemporary literary scenes? In the year 1927, Benjamin explored European literary landscapes, among other things, by reconceptualizing anthologies or service as travel guides. There are two notable examples, what he called a Baedeker durch das geistige Paris and a Russischer Bädeker. Seemingly, the status of the Baedeker illusion here goes hand in hand with transposing a tool for traveling behavior onto the way one navigates through literary scenes. To get a better sense whether this is just a catchy metaphor that Benjamin uses or to what degree it is reflected in his method and audience approach, I will give you a quick overview over the historical development of Baedeker's travel guide and its reception among Benjamin's contemporaries. Baedeker, of some even coined the inventor of the modern travel guide, was founded in 1829 by Karl Baedeker in Leipzig and continued by 4 further generations. They published over 180 years and in 3 languages. Characteristically, as you can see here on the left, they were bound in red and rose linen, golden engraving, and fall into the period of industrialized bookmaking, allowing for a cheap production and circulation of high numbers. Baedeker is deemed to be the, I quote, giant of tourism handbook, due to developing the structure of the travel handbook and thus having lasting impact for modeling and remodeling modern travel behavior. The innovative features were, first, a series of interlocking itineraries. They were quite linear because they were based on ship and railway connections, no cars, no road trips at that point. Second, with those itineraries, they organized text in an understandable logic by filtering sites and places for the tourist so that they could have something like a complete round trip through the designated highlights for their cultural heritage and leisure tourism. Already mid-19th century, Baedeker abundant printing illustrations, since travelers should see themselves, but rather equipped the books with detailed and precise cartographic material and also introduced ratings with 1 or 2 asterisks as a system of recommendation. Here, it may not be surprising for the time that they demonstrate quite a bit of anti-Semitism and xenophobic stereotyping. In all 3 respects, Baedeker is an example and reflection of the structural historical shift in tourism, and as observable in Europe, corresponds to, but also reflects the middle-class travel of his age. In the 20th century, Baedeker had already become synonymous for guidebook or traveler's handbook. As a consequence, there's a series of literary engagements with Baedeker, ranging from mere allusions to the name to serious attempts of providing alternative travel guides. And I picked a few examples here. The illustration does not yet match the quotation. So the first one is Der gefühlvolle Bädeker, which Benjamin demands from a friend in a letter in 1913. What we have here an example which is imitating and extending the principle of Baedeker. The second one, which is now actually corresponds to the photo, is Arthur Hollicher's Narrenbädeker, Aufzeichnungen aus Paris und London mit Holzschnitten von Franz Maseria. Arthur Hollicher was a renowned travel writer, having his literary breakthrough in 1912 with the book Amerika heute und morgen. Also like Benjamin among those German-speaking writers reporting on his travel to the young Soviet Union. The Baedeker allusion here refers to a more like apocalyptic farewell to a canonized traveling gaze seeking cultural and revolutionary inspiration in Paris. In that sense, it is more a literary historical reflection on how forms of traveling were intertwined with the literary tradition and cultural imaginaries. However, due to a lawsuit by Baedeker Publishing House for defamation of their name, so it's Narrenbädeker, Fool's Travel Guide, half of the print run had to be retracted and is since republished under the title Narrenführer. For such reasons, Baedeker was often spelled differently to avoid any copyright infringements. Then there were also two series aiming to provide alternative travel descriptions in a feuilletonist style. In German, it was Was nicht im Baedeker steht, and then there was a Dutch version taking that up as well. And last, here are examples from a very popular journal for cultural arts and politics, Die Weltbühne, also just 3 examples where it features as an allusion in the title. I will stop at that point. As you have seen, Baedeker exemplified new patterns in modern travel behavior and guidance to navigating geographical, cultural, and linguistically different spheres. In the first half of the 20th century, especially in the interwar period, it thus turned into a reference point for a variety of different literary adaptations, metaphorical allusions, and methodological reflections. How does Benjamin fit into this picture? Before Benjamin experimented with reconceptualizing anthologies as travel guides in 1927, one of his journalistic pieces in early 1926 serves as interesting pretext. On 1st January 1926, Paulko and Partheim had published a rather satirical piece on Baedeker, so here's quite a few quotations which could give you, if interested, some insight. In fact, I will mostly summarize it. He addresses most innovative elements that are characteristic of the new travel guide. He mocks the informative advice for travels and intercultural encounters, but he also polemicizes against the designated linear itineraries and highlights with this rating system of the asterixes. Therefore, he mocks Baedeker, in fact, as some sort of poet, and his travel instructions as taking some kind of poetic liberty or even making him into an artistic dictator. So for that, we may especially refer to the last quote. 5 issues later, Benjamin sets against it a piece under the heading Baedeker bedankt sich. This is the full review, I won't read out the full one, don't worry. Where he polemicizes against the Ressentiments seiner Landsleute when confronted with a modern travel guide. As a result, he calls out the deutsche Schmock, for whom the originality of traveling seems to fall apart once confronted with restructured itineraries and designated highlights. Nun ist er also der größte Dichter. Im Übrigen hat er Zeit gehabt, an das Ressentiment seiner Landsleute sich zu akklimatisieren. Die werden es ihm nämlich nicht vergessen, sie um die Originalität ihrer Reisen gebracht zu haben und dass man schwarz auf weiß die Punkte verzeichnet findet, die, wenn es nach Herrn Meyer und Frau Schulze ginge, als Stätten ihres eigenen innersten Erlebens durch sie erst wären geweiht worden. Ein Buch von peinlicher Solidität, das die Reiseabenteuer außer Kurs bringt und die Erzählungen einer Irrfahrt an die Frage „Und warum kaufen Sie sich keinen Baedeker?" verpuffen lässt. With allusions to originality, inneres Erleben, to be provided by Reiseabenteuer and Irrfahrten, Benjamin debunks a nostalgic resentment building on the historical legacy of travel writing, Bildungsreisen, and the cult of the genius. In other words, the issue of Baedeker for Benjamin renders visible a historical shift in travel behavior, and thus necessarily any literary and intellectual reflection of it. As I will show you now, finally, Benjamin's own attempt of writing a Baedeker for the French and Russian-speaking intellectual field plays with transposing this very shift in travel behavior onto novating the navigation of literary scenes and their implied national literary canons more generally. Concerning the French sphere, this idea of a travel guide featured in a collected review called Böckbesprechungen, which was published on 1st August 1927 in the Dutch avant-garde journal I-10. As last book, he comments on the Anthology de la Nouvelle Prose Française. Here you have the cover. In its preface, anthologies are thought of as a most characteristic of their epoch. You have this on the top, le plus caractéristique de notre époque. Insofar they present a document, highlighted in bold further down, of those, and not a retrospective selection or curation by a literary historian. Benjamin then gives this understanding another functional twist. Beurteilen kann solche Werke nur ein großer Kenner der Literatur. Ihren ganzen Wert nach schätzen nur der Neuling. So sind sie, insbesondere für den Ausländer, der sich ein Bild vom Stand des französischen Schrifttums machen will, wie geschaffen. Als eine Art von Baedeker durchs geistige Paris, die meisten namhaften Autoren leben in der Hauptstadt, sind sie dem Provinzialen nahezu ebenso wichtig. Das neuere Buch ist sogar noch etwas mehr. Forschungsbericht aus unbereisten Gegenden, wenn man so will. Denn der Verlag hat Wert darauf gelegt, neben den klassischen Proben der neuen Autoren von jedem auch einige ungedruckte Seiten zu bringen. Both characterizations, the one of the travel guides for foreigners and also the Forschungsbericht, or fieldwork report about blind spots on a literary map, operate within a cartographic register. This mapping, according to Benjamin, has a particular merit for foreigners. First of all, it has the informative purpose of orientating an audience not familiar with the language and cultural terrain. The aim is then to represent a temporary cross-section, or Stand, rather than cultivating or confirming a national literary canon for domestic native speakers. On the other hand, it is this outsider perspective that also introduces an epistemic chance. If taken as a document of an era, such an anthology both assembles contemporaneous literary production and how writers, here the editors, perceive and interpret their own respective scenes. Unlike immersed insiders that are participants in this discursive battle, an outsider might be more inclined to second-order reflection of those particular discursive self-fashionings by insiders. It is noteworthy here that this epistemic privilege of the foreigner's perspective finds an even wider application in the composition of the collected review. Here I listed a few of the other books he reviewed, because Benjamin, in fact, juxtaposed various books of intellectuals that survey, conceptualize, and imagine their own scenes. The first one from Gaston Batti reflects on the history of theatre in France and Europe. Paul Léoton, as critic, likewise chronicles and evaluates the theatre scene, and Ramon Gómez de la Serna addresses the role of the cirque. At last, we do have the prose anthology. So to some degree, Benjamin's collected review presents itself a travel guide, not only through French literature, but the discursive landscapes of meta-literary and meta-cultural communication, meaning how French intellectuals conceptualized their own intelligentsia. Publishing this second-order observation in international context, we do have a German review about French intellectuals in a Dutch magazine, can be taken as part of Benjamin's conviction that an intellectual should navigate their local embeddedness by reflecting on their international entanglement. Concerning the Russian-speaking sphere, Benjamin did not comment on an anthology of contemporary Russian literature. After his Moscow stay in 1927, he noted down a list with potential article topics, among them, here highlighted in bold, a Russischer Bädeker. Just as a side note here, the last German Baedeker on Russia was issued in 1912, so before the First World War and the Russian October Revolution. It thus was clearly outdated in terms of its maps that it presented of political, economic, and infrastructural boundaries. So the idea to come up with a travel guide to this sphere of the so-called Soviet experiment, its state, culture, and politics, has a specific currency. For one, there is a huge amount of travelers who Michael David Fox would call the pilgrims, partisans, and political tourists in the 1920s. And for another, any intellectual cultural mapping here goes hand in hand with a more general geographical, economic, cultural, political remapping of the Soviet sphere and the system itself after its declared radical rupture with previous traditions. Anyway, returning to Benjamin's list with possible article topics, the keyword Russischer Bädeker resulted into 2 Berichte or reports, which you can see both here, published in the Berlin-based journal Die Literarische Welt and the Dutch magazine I10. The titles are Die politische Gruppierung der russischen Schriftsteller and Neue Dichtung in Russland. Benjamin attempts in the first a rather relational grouping of positions and key figures, one that he then refines in the second one. For Willi Haas, the editor of the Weimar Journal, the function of such service is to, I'll paraphrase, inform the readers adequately about this decisive period of transition in the young USSR. Interestingly, Benjamin bases his grouping again on the manner in which other locally embedded intellectuals conceptualized their own respective scene. He reports in his diary that the writer and secretary of the Writers' Association, Bela Ilesh, had given him a Schemata zur politischen Gruppierung der russischen Schriftsteller. Here you can see how Benjamin noted it down in his own diary. In accordance with this diagram, Benjamin informs his German readers about the Russian scene. However, in this instance, he guides his readers through the Russian-speaking field not in the framework of a literary landscape, but by conceptualizing it in an infographic manner. For reasons of brevity, I will turn directly to the second report, Neue Dichtung in Russland, in which Benjamin refines this, what I would call infographic register, as methodological approach more clearly. Benjamin opens this article with the reflection on how literary history is both an enforcing and a stabilizing medium of the national imagination by cultivating a continuous national canon. Aus der wissenschaftlichen Literaturgeschichte stammt die Gewohnheit, neue Epochen, Strömungen im Schrifttum aus der unmittelbar vorhergehenden literarischen Situation zu erklären. Die wissenschaftliche Haltbarkeit und Zweckmäßigkeit eines solchen Verfahrens mag dahingestellt bleiben. Evident aber ist das eine: Das Schrifttum, das sich jetzt in Russland herausbildet, aus der Literatur zu entwickeln, welche die Generationen Dostojewskis, Turgenjews, Tolstois hervorgebracht haben, wäre zumindest ein Umweg. Der gegebene Ausgangspunkt einer Charakteristik sind die veränderten Kulturverhältnisse, die mit der Revolution sich eingestellt haben. He polemicizes against here a universality of academic historiography that is dedicated and also methodologically motivated through a sense of continuity. However, he renders the adequacy of such an approach for the contemporary Russia as questionable. The last paragraph actually ends with his claim that Soviet writing, in fact, experiments with nothing less than a new form of historiography. And you see here the last sentence we already heard. Das letzte Schrifttum Russlands ist Vorläufer einer neuen Geschichtsschreibung, weit eher als einer neuen Belletristik. This new belles lettres is based on the idea that new forms of experience, ways of life, and social and political practices have been established after the revolution. I quote, daneben hat das Leben eine Fülle von neuen Typen, neuen Situationen geschaffen, die vor allem einmal registriert, beschrieben und bewertet sein wollen. Correspondingly, it necessitates a new form of writing and of writing literary history. The structure of the characteristic that he then gives is threefold. First, there is an account of political groupings and the developments of the past 5 years, which he summarizes under the heading of Literaturpolitik. Second, there is a list of outsiders. And third, a characterization of major works in this period. I quote, in dieses Gradnetz werden wir nunmehr die Entwicklungskurve der letzten 5 Jahre einzeichnen und dabei, wie die praktische informatorische Tendenz dieser kurzen Ausführungen es nahelegt, als Orientierungspunkte die Hauptwerke der jetzigen Literatur, wenn möglich in Übersetzung, namhaft machen. What Benjamin claims to be the basis for the new Soviet literature in this previous article, so the use of statistical visualization, serves here as methodological reflection on how to reinterpret a literary field. And he implements this initial cartographic ambition of the Russische Bädeker through the field semantics of a Gradnetz, which is the mathematical basis for cartography. Thus, he shifts the register from a territorial logic of fixed locations to the mathematical logic of relational positionality. Comparing now Benjamin's travel guides for different cultural and linguistic areas, he did not simply choose and impose one register everywhere. When addressing the French scene, Benjamin rather stayed within a cartographic register of the map or landscape as indicated and employed in the anthology's preface. When addressing the Russian field, he appropriates a mathematical and infographic one, echoing a contemporary Soviet trend of statistical visualization. Benjamin's surveying or chronicling of those fields takes up impulses of their local self-fashionings, each of them a possible recalibration of their present habits and practices to relate to history. To come to a close, let me repeat and compare how Benjamin arrived at experimenting with travel guides as a way of critically remodeling the outlook for literary historiography. First of all, his take that he's pursuing here is firmly grounded in the liminal contact zones between disciplines and professions, here namely of the scholar, the literary critic, and cultural journalist. For that, he emphasizes that literary practices of the present form the starting point to revisit the method of the self-understanding of literary historiography. Thereby, his professional porosity is interwoven with his cultural crossings. Both his personal networks and the frameworks created by journals like Die Literarische Welt or I-10 fueled a twist in Benjamin's self-fashioning as a critic. His reflections arise from the epistemic privileges that he ascribes to the vantage point of the Ausländer, or the gaze from abroad. He mocked isolated geographic and cultural self-perceptions as optische Täuschungen, and finally he also highlighted his own Neue Optik, New Optics from Moscow and to Berlin to be an instructive defamiliarization from the German sphere. Benjamin then experimented with different journalistic forms of mediating and mapping out other cultural scenes for a German readership, to explore the use, audience, and medium of future literary histories beyond the traditional academic monograph or anthology. The allusion that he makes here to the travel guide appears to be more than just a metaphor. Historically speaking, Baedeker's travel handbook innovated travel design and behavior, which Benjamin transposes onto new ways of navigating or exploring literary fields. The takeaway is twofold. For one, anthologies, reports, and surveys or collected reviews exploring literary landscapes for non-native speakers serve the purpose of an intercultural orientation instead of consolidating a particular national self-understanding for native speakers. And let's be clear, Benjamin did not mean that based on this, any literary history should be only for foreigners. So let's say on German ground, one should exclusively read French or Spanish, or on the British ground, one should only read literature in Italian. Such cultural crossings, on the contrary, are important for the target audience and train a specific critical self-assessment, both as a potential of schooling the reader, but even more so, the writer. For another, Benjamin's two Baedekers explore an intercultural perspective that may foster second-order reflections on local cultural self-fashionings of how intellectuals grasp their respective scenes. In Benjamin's trajectory, it is the critic who renegotiates the relation between literature and history, starting from present transformations. Eventually, this practice would enable also a socio-historical self-reflection of the intelligentsia, or the very position of the intellectual via cross-cultural insights, which he would elaborate, for example, in his famous surrealism essay in 1929. For those of you having read this essay, you will recall the introduction where he states that the German critic builds his so-called power station or Kraftwerk from afar to measure the currents and streams of the French avant-garde, which he indeed does by a triangulation of the French, German and Russian intelligentsia. But I shall leave it at that and would say we've reached the final destination for the itinerary of this lecture, and I want to thank you very much for your attention.